Hello, everybody. What you're about to hear is a bonus episode that I put out over on my Patreon feed a few months ago. So if you like what you hear, you can head over to patreon.com/reflectinghistory and you can sign up to support the podcast, which can get you a bunch of different perks, a recommendations newsletter that I put out every month. There's bonus episodes like this one you're about to hear, some behind the scenes content, early access, a couple of episodes from my audio course, and so on and so forth. If you don't like what you hear today, then you can just ignore it and go on living your life, hopefully having a great Thanksgiving and a happy holiday season. Another way to support the podcast might be to check out my audio course at avid.fm/reflectinghistory. The course is called Nazi Germany and the Battle for the Human Heart. And it might be a good holiday gift if you have any siblings or friends or family members interested in Nazi Germany, social dynamics in authoritarian societies, or deep questions of moral responsibility in extraordinary circumstances. 20% of all proceeds from that audio course go to GiveWell's Maximum Impact Fund. All that being said, if you don't want to support the podcast on Patreon, or if you don't care about the audio course, you can still support in a whole bunch of other different ways just by continuing to listen, maybe by telling a friend, subscribing or following on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all of the other pod things. You can also leave a rating or review on any of those platforms, and that helps a bunch too. So again, I hope you enjoy the bonus episode and have a great Thanksgiving. There is certainly a danger in looking at history as simply a series of facts and dates and events. We've all been there, right? The high school teacher passes out the textbooks and he or she says, open up the textbook to chapter 13, read the chapter, answer the questions at the end, define the vocab terms, and then turn it in. I think that this style of learning about history is flawed in a number of different ways. First of all, none of the facts or dates or events gives us the how or the why. The important questions of meaning and significance. Analyzing the why of something is incredibly difficult. Understanding the motivations of human beings and why people do things is something that philosophers can argue about and have been arguing about for millennia. I mean, even something as simple as ordering a pizza and deciding on the pepperoni pizza instead of the cheese pizza. Philosophers can debate how much free will you actually had in that decision. Was the decision your own, or was it more motivated by the surrounding factors, the environment around you? Does free will exist, or is it merely an illusion? So if understanding why you went with pepperoni instead of cheese is that difficult to understand the motivations behind your decision making, imagine how difficult it is for historians to piece together why people from ancient times did things. What were their motivations? The why and the how. These are the tough questions to answer, and a lot of times they get skipped over in traditional history education. Sometimes it's easier to just avoid those conversations and stick to the facts, the events, the dates, the things that are simple and easy. Now, all of that being said, I'm willing to bet that if you are listening to this podcast right now, I'm probably beating a dead horse here. This point that the traditional way history is taught is lacking in a lot of different areas is a point that gets made actually quite a bit, and I'm probably preaching to the choir here. But I do think there's something at the root of this basic historical approach that I've been describing, and it's something that doesn't get talked about as much. I think oftentimes what's at the root of this sort of basic historical approach is a general belief and a general understanding that history is something that is set in stone. So obviously, the events of history are set in stone. No one's going back in time and changing anything, and it's impossible to change the past, at least the way we understand the way that time works. But our understanding of history is not set in stone. So someone approaching history from the more basic perspective might read the textbook chapter and then define the vocab terms at the end of the chapter, and then think that they fully understand that time period in history or that event in history or whatever the topic might be. And because of that, they're not necessarily open to new discoveries or new perspectives or new approaches that might shed a new and different light on that particular topic. So in my view, you can contrast this sort of basic approach with a view of history that is actually constantly evolving. There is a process that is taking place that is somewhat similar to the scientific method in science. Historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, philosophers, etc., are all constantly asking new questions, uncovering new things, approaching history from new perspectives, and they're making new discoveries. This might lead them to ask questions, come up with a hypothesis, and then test it against whatever the evidence says or doesn't say. And that historical process is continually happening, it's continually evolving, and ultimately it's enriching our understanding of history. And in some cases, it might even overturn our understanding of certain topics. An example of this is the idea of discovery. Sometimes new evidence, oftentimes this comes from the realm of archaeology, where new stuff is dug up literally from the ground that complicates our understanding of a historical topic. Maybe it's the discovery of Roman coins in India that perhaps suggests that the Roman Empire's trade network extended farther than we thought it did originally. Maybe it's the discovery of agricultural techniques further back in history than we thought agriculture originated. A great example of this has been unfolding in the last couple of weeks. A new skeleton skull has been revealed to archaeologists and historians are now reacting to this quote-unquote dragon man. And now everybody is scrambling to uncover what this new discovery means for the origins of humanity. How does the discovery complicate our understanding? Just to provide some context here, I'll quote from an article by historian Patrick Wyman, and I'll try to link to the article in the show notes, but he says, quote, "According to new research published last week, the human family has gained a new member, Homo longi, colloquially called Dragon Man, identified from a fossilized skull found in northeastern China. The skull is at least 146,000 years old and could be even older. A construction laborer working in the city of Harbin discovered the skull way back in 1933, but reportedly hid it in a well to keep it out of the hands of the Japanese, who then occupied northeastern China. It remained unknown to scholars until just before the man's death in 2018, when he revealed its existence to his family. They retrieved the skull and gave it to researchers at the Geoscience Museum of Hebei, GEO University. The skull, which is incredibly well preserved for a specimen of that age, and among the best preserved for any, obviously belonged to an archaic human. It is large and robust, and quite unlike that of our particular species. This is a pretty big deal. If the researchers who published the discovery are correct, then the skull from Harbin represents a brand new lineage of our human family. Moreover, they argue that this newly discovered lineage, rather than that of the Neanderthals, is actually the closest relative to modern humans. So how should we understand this new and incredibly exciting discovery? And where does Dragon Man fit into our current grasp of the deep human past? Have we found humanity's closest ancient relative? End quote. I do recommend reading that article just to get a sense of what was going on there because it's interesting. But Wyman ultimately concludes that although this is a cool and exciting new discovery, ultimately it's just another piece of the puzzle. It's just another part of this historical process that is continuing to play out as we learn more about the past. So this is not really revisionist history in any real sense. Sometimes real discoveries are made about the past because our understanding of the past is not set in stone. Just because we learned it one way 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 50 years ago doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way it actually was. And guess what? Discoveries like this are going to continue happening over and over again. Our understanding of history is going to continue evolving. And it's not rewriting history, it's not revising history, it's adding to our understanding. It's new evidence that is fitting into a bigger picture and helping us to tell a better story. It's the historical scientific method that we mentioned earlier playing itself out. In the same way, just as new information or new discoveries can complicate our understanding of history, also new perspectives, new sources, new ways of finding meaning can evolve our understanding of history as well. In her book, Running from Bondage, historian Karen Cook Bell tells the story of fugitive slave women in revolutionary America. She talks about what life was like for these women as slaves, and she talks about why they may have sought freedom and where that desire for freedom came from, and ultimately how and why they fled slavery and what their lives were like as they did so. In the book, Karen Cook Bell makes an interesting point, saying, quote, "The voices of enslaved women do not always exist where we would like." End quote. What I think she means here is that sometimes when you're studying a historical topic, you are looking into something that hasn't necessarily been studied a lot before, and therefore it may not have been part of the quote-unquote traditional way that history has been told and taught. In this particular case, you have to think about it a little bit. The goal of the fugitive slave is, for the most part, to remain undetected. The penalty for being discovered or the penalty for being caught running away from slavery was oftentimes terrible and deadly. So you aren't going to have a lot of firsthand accounts from these women as they're escaping slavery. You might have to dig a little bit deeper into the source material. Historians like Karen Cook Bell are able to use new ways of putting together sources, and by doing this, you can add a new perspective and a fresh understanding of what not only life might have been like for, in this case, fugitive women slaves, but also the revolutionary period as a whole in America. Here, Bell talks about how she used, in large part, advertisements from old newspapers that advertised for fugitive slaves. Oftentimes, when a slave would run away, the slave master would put out an advertisement in a local newspaper describing what the slave looked like and maybe other features about him or her in order that somebody might capture them and send them back. But by taking this fresh perspective, Karen Cook Bell is able to look at these advertisements, and instead of looking at them as advertisements, she can look at them as insights into those fugitive women and what does it tell us about their lives. She says, quote, The ultimate value of runaway advertisements lies chiefly in what they can tell us about the life stories of individual slaves. Each advertisement describes part of the story of a real person, not an abstraction. When further research in other sources is undertaken, these human stories can be fleshed out as real human beings begin to emerge from the records. There are limits to the utility of the advertisements in understanding the lives of enslaved women. We do not know the ultimate fate of the majority of the individuals named in the advertisements. Enslavers did not place advertisements for every runaway, since many were captured quickly. But given these limitations, the runaway and captured advertisements still offer a remarkable amount of information about individual human beings caught in a horrific system of bondage. And when augmented with other sources, such as petitions, letters, county books, parish records, official correspondence, diaries, and plantation records, the advertisements can begin to restore human dignity to a group of persons who have long been denied their dignity. End quote. So we have another example here of the ways in which a historian can peel back the layers of the onion slowly over time and reveal new truths about our history. Again, this is another example of how, while the past is set in stone, our understanding of the past is not set in stone. And by looking at things from a fresh perspective, in this case, taking a look at those newspaper advertisements and some other sources from a different perspective, we can now learn more about a particular topic and add to our overall understanding of what's going on in revolutionary America. And just as our ancient Dragon Man discovery and the discovery of skeletons and bones and all that stuff is going to keep happening over time, new perspectives are going to keep coming over time. And counters to the perspectives will also come as well. And those new perspectives and new counters hopefully are judged on their merits and going through this historical process of asking questions, looking at evidence, and trying to determine how all of this fits into our broader understanding of history. Another part of this historical process that I'm hopefully trying to describe here is finding different ways to hold up the mirror of history to our present times, and potentially, by looking through that mirror, complicating again or evolving our understanding of our own history. Learning facts and dates and events and stuff that happened in ancient times is interesting and fun, and that's great. But ultimately, if you're not using that understanding of history to help understand the present times, then to me at least, you're not getting as much as you could by fully interacting and engaging with the history in a more complex way. Probably the classic example of this in American history, at least, is the inherent hypocrisy of the American Revolution. The question of how freedom and slavery can coincide. In her book, Karen Cook Bell says, quote, "Given America's revolutionary heritage, it is not surprising that slavery has long captured the collective historical consciousness of the nation. Students and faculty alike continue to ponder the imponderable, the relationship between slavery and the kinds of freedom enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution." End quote. As Bell points out there, this topic has long been an example of people holding up that mirror of history to the present day and trying to determine what our understanding of our history tells us about the present day and vice versa. In her book, she gives some pretty amazing examples of, at least one example of a former slave known as Elizabeth Freeman who sues the state for her freedom on constitutional grounds. Basically saying, hey, that historical document that says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I'm holding that mirror up to my present day circumstance, and I'm not seeing that. I'm not seeing life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And she actually won that case, believe it or not. Unfortunately, the vast majority of slaves did not have that opportunity. But my point here is only to give an example of how discussing history in the context of present times and holding up that historical mirror to the present and asking difficult questions is important, and it can help us evolve our understanding of history. And it's also something that is always happening. It's not some new phenomenon. It's a part of this historical process that is continuing to evolve. Asking questions, going through the process, looking at evidence, holding up that mirror to the present, asking how a topic contributes to our overall understanding of a time period, what the lived experience of different groups of people during a time period was like, and how that compares to the modern day. And ultimately, can the past help us shed light on the present? All of these questions and all of these ways of understanding are all part of this historical process, at least in my opinion. So ultimately, to me, memorizing facts and dates and events and viewing that history as set in stone isn't going to evolve our understanding, and it's not going to help us put history to good use. And to me, this historical process of new discoveries, new perspectives, new sources, holding up the historical mirror to the present times, this is a more interesting and ultimately, I think, a more real and true way to understand history.